This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. Well, we are approaching a moment because it was at 11 o'clock in the morning Greenwich Mean Time when the armistice came into effect and the guns fell silent on the Western Front and many other parts of the world in which the First World War was still raging. It's a moment when we think back to a generation of people who in most cases we never even knew. But equally, we think about World War II and all the conflicts since, of course, up to and including Afghanistan and Iraq. This year's commemoration is by far the biggest I can remember in my lifetime. I've never seen my village, for example, in Kent, make such an effort as they have done this year, and that is going on right across the country. Now, on LBC, we have reporters out all over the country who'll be bringing you events over the next hour or two.
At the cenotaph, where royals, politicians and thousands of veterans will be honouring the fallen this morning, I'm LBC's Rachel Venables in London.
While I'm LBC's Dan Wilson at the Welsh National War Memorial in Cardiff, where veterans and First Minister Carwyn Jones will pay their respects to the tens of thousands of Welsh soldiers who gave their lives.
Here on Edinburgh's Royal Mile, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon will join ex-servicemen at the Stone of Remembrance. I'm LBC's Derek Ferguson.
And as the Remembrance Sunday service happens at the National Arboretum in Staffordshire.
Now, we all know that it's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but very few people know why that time came to be and how a British politician tried to make it later in the day. Joining me this morning is Jamie Weems, the Earl of Weems, naval historian and relative of Admiral Sir Roslin Weems, who was the senior British representative in that railway carriage and was the sole British signatory on the armistice piece of paper. Jamie, good morning. So were the Germans completely beaten at this point?
The Germans had been beaten in the field in France and Flanders, and the last straw for them, they'd been retreating since about the 18th of July 1918, but then on the 27th of September the Allies penetrated the Hindenburg Line, which was their last sort of bastion they were hoping to defend. And so on the 29th of September, General Ludendorff, who was in charge of the German war effort, told the Kaiser that the war was lost and that the Germans must seek an armistice.
So when you say an armistice, it sounds almost like a gentleman's agreement to end a war. Why did the Allies not push for a surrender?
An armistice could include a surrender. An armistice just means you're stopping the war, and the terms on which you stop it are to be agreed between the parties.
OK, and this brings us all to the forest of Compiègne in France and a railway carriage. Who was in that railway carriage?
In that carriage was General Foch, or Field Marshal Foch, I should call him, who was very high up French general, and he was there representing the Allied and associated armies. The United States wasn't an ally, it was an associate. So Foch represented and signed for the Allied and associated armies, and Admiral Weems represented and signed for the Allied and associated navies.
And so the French and British were there, and the German government were there, or the German representatives.
Representatives of the German government.
Right. So these negotiations, as I understand it, went on for some time.
There were two sessions. I think the first one was on the 9th of November. They had to stop the fighting and allow the Germans to come through the lines to get to Compiègne, and they had a preliminary discussion on the 9th. Then they went back, took the terms offered to them by Foch and Weems. They took them back to Germany, had another discussion, then came for the final negotiation very early in the morning of the 11th of November.
So they were obviously they were ready to sign. Why did it become 11-11-11? What was the driving force behind that?
Well, the actual signature of the armistice agreement was at 5:10 a.m. And it was agreed that it would be considered as 5 a.m. just for the sake of simplicity. And Weems had been instructed by the government to make the armistice come into effect at 2:30 p.m. on the 11th of November.
That's the British government saying
That's
this.
by the British government. And he thought that wasn't a very good idea for two reasons. One, it wasn't poetic, whereas if it was 11 a.m., it would be the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And he thought that the millions who had suffered in the war and died in the war deserved a bit of poetry for the end of their ordeal. And secondly, he thought many thousands of young men would be killed between 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m.
Which was undoubtedly true.
Quite a few did get killed on the morning of the 11th.
Yes. So he's instructed by the British government then to negotiate for 2:30. So what happens next?
So he signed it at 5:10 a.m. to come into effect at 11 a.m. And then at 7:30 he left Compiègne in a car and went back to Paris, went to the Ministry of War, met Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, went on to the British Embassy, telephoned King George V, who was well known to him because he'd commanded the Royal Yacht and they'd been in the same class at Naval College at Osborne, and so he...
So they were pals?
They were very well known to each other. So he telephoned the king and told him that there was going to be an armistice at 11 o'clock. And the king did not keep this great news to himself. He spread it around, and so by 11 a.m. there were enormous crowds in the Mall in front of Buckingham Palace cheering the king and the royal family. And having rung the king, Weems then from the British Embassy in Paris rang the Prime Minister and told him the news, and he then sat down and wrote a detailed telegram to the government of what he had done at Compiègne. And he then that evening he got in a train which took him to Calais, and then a ferry that took him to Folkestone, where he arrived at 9:30 a.m. on the 12th of November, and then he motored up to London with his wife and was immediately summoned to Buckingham Palace and gave the king an account of the final negotiations and the signing. And then he sat around for the rest of the 12th expecting that the government would ask him to come to Downing Street to explain to them what had happened. And he sat there waiting for the telephone to ring, and it didn't. And
Why did Lloyd George want it to be 2:30?
Lloyd George wanted it to be 2:30 because he wanted to announce it. He had hoped to announce it on the 9th of November when he was making a speech at the Guildhall, but tragically for him it didn't happen on the 9th of November, so he was then hoping to announce it at Prime Minister's Question Time in the House of Commons at 2:45 p.m. on the 11th of November. And so Weems then was summoned to the War Cabinet the next day, well, by now the 13th of November, and he had expected that he would be well received and they'd be pleased to see him. Far from that, he was greeted with icy silence and black looks, and he was absolutely amazed. He couldn't quite work out what their problem was, and then it was, and they were very unpleasant to him, and made it clear that he'd been told to sign it at 2:30, and he'd done it at 11, and he'd disobeyed their instructions, and they were as unpleasant to him as they could reasonably manage, and he went away puzzled. And then he heard from various sources that the cause of the unpleasantness was that Lloyd George had been wanting to announce it at 2:30.
So you're saying at the end of the war to end all wars, the greatest conflict humanity had seen, that the British Prime Minister wanted to wholly and fully politicise it.
That's right, and Weems just couldn't believe it. He didn't have a very high opinion of the politicians of the day. He'd come back from the Mediterranean, where he'd been commanding in Egypt, or off Egypt. He'd come back in September 1917, and he was amazed at how silly they seemed to be. He was amazed that they had greeted the Russian Revolution with ecstasy, thinking that this was going to make the Russians fight harder. It did nothing of the sort. They'd even been quite pleased about the Bolshevik Revolution and had not known whether to be fighting with the Bolsheviks or against them.
So his opinion of politicians was quite low.
It was getting lower all the time.
But this story, I mean, you know, as you say, had the war gone on to 230, one doesn't know how many thousands more would have been wounded or killed. Did this story get out at the time that the Prime Minister had wanted it to be later in the day?
No. I mean, Weems wasn't the sort of person to go public on a thing like that.
So Admiral Sir Roslin Weems has defied the Prime Minister. He's been met with this icy response on the 13th of November. What happened next?
He continued to do his job as First Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff, but it was brought to an end much quicker than it should have been. In 1921, I think it was, he was superseded by Admiral Beatty, and all the other heads of services in 1918 or 19, like the Sir Douglas Haig and people like that, they were all given earldoms, and they were all given £100,000.
Wow, a lot of money.
And £100,000 you have to multiply by about 50, so it's about £5 million to £10 million, which was well worth having.
Yeah.
And so Weems didn't get any money from the government, and he had to wait 2 years to get a barony rather than earldom, so he became Lord Wester Weems. And then because he didn't have a vast amount of money, he had to work for Marconi for the next dozen years or so, and he went to live in France, in Cannes, because it was cheaper.
Wow.
So he suffered quite a lot relative to what he would have enjoyed otherwise, because of his determination that it should be the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
So the man that signed the armistice, that managed to get us 11-11-11, was treated vindictively.
He was,
by the
but I'm
British
sure
state.
he didn't regret it for one moment.
So how did you find the story out?
I found the story out because I knew his daughter very well, who was a distinguished historian, particularly of 18th century Europe, and she told me the whole story.
I just find it absolutely extraordinary. I mean, and had this got out, clearly he was a gentleman and he wasn't going to reveal these conversations, but had this story got out at the time, it actually would have turned the other way and been devastating for Lloyd George, wouldn't it?
I mean, there was an election coming up called the Khaki election, which Lloyd George won hands down. But obviously everybody was pleased the war was at an end. But no doubt it would have not gone down very well to know that there'd been this dispute about when it was going to end.
Quite extraordinary story. And can I ask you, as an historian who studied this period, we hear a lot, and we have this week, there's been a massive amount of coverage leading up to the centenary of the end of the Great War, as it was known then. You do hear a school of thought that says it was all a shocking waste. It was a complete waste of time. Was it, in your opinion, a necessary war for us to be involved in?
The German Empire was going to conquer Europe if we didn't stop them. If we hadn't been involved, they'd have beaten France in 1914, and they'd have beaten Russia in 1915, and they would have dominated the continent, and the independent nations of the continent would have become satellites of Germany, and not a very nice Germany at that. They performed appalling atrocities in Belgium. One of the first things they did when they got into Belgium was to burn the library of the University of Louvain, which was the finest medieval library in Europe. There's every reason to think that a Europe ruled by Germany would have been an incredibly unpleasant place. They would have immediately used the resources of Europe to build a high seas fleet that could have beaten us in the North Sea. So we would have lost our independence and our empire and our way of life and the values we held so dear if we hadn't joined in beside France in 1914.
So a heavy price, but a necessary one.
It was an appalling price. It was a bloody war. There was absolutely no way around it. We invented the tank, which was one of the few things that helped, and we got our tactics much better with our creeping barrages and surprise attacks and moving the focus of the attack very quickly. So we learnt what lessons were to be learnt, but it was still a very bloody business with machine guns and heavy artillery.
Yeah. Thank you. Jamie Weems, Earl of Weems, thank you for coming in and sharing that extraordinary story that I think hardly anybody in this country knows, but they need to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd never heard that story before, and I bet you hadn't either. And I have to say, I think Admiral Sir Rosalind Weems emerges from this as a great hero. It's because of him that it is the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And even if the establishment was vindictive towards him, he did the right thing. Tell me, on this very significant day in our calendar, what is the significance of Remembrance Sunday to you? Let me know on 0345 6060 973. You can text to 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. You can watch us on Facebook and comment there too. You're listening to LBC on this Remembrance Sunday, and it's now 10:19. Now, the rain has stopped in London as 10,000 veterans gather in Whitehall to march past the cenotaph after our own national service of remembrance on this centenary of the armistice. The biggest international event is, of course, taking place in Paris. There are 60 world leaders there, including, of course, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and many, many others. And it was extraordinarily seen yesterday that Emmanuel Macron and Chancellor Merkel went to Compiègne. They went to that railway carriage in the clearing in the forest in Compiègne, just north of Paris. And it's the first time that a German leader has been there since the end of the war, because perhaps what you don't know, in that carriage where the Germans were made to sign the armistice, the French were made to sign their own surrender in 1940. It's something Hitler did to them. So it is a place of deep significance in both wars, and it's the first time a German leader has been there. So that was yesterday. Today, they're in the middle of their national commemoration, and ours will begin outside the cenotaph very shortly, along with thousands of events that are taking place all over the country. And I have to say, I can't remember myself, I really can't, a Remembrance Sunday. I guess it's fortunate that it's the 11th as well. I can't remember one being as big as this. The Royal British Legion estimates something like 35 million people have put money into a poppy box. So it's not everybody, but boy, it's a lot of people. So what does it mean to you? Steve in Gainsborough, what does it mean to you this morning?
Morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
Great to have a chat. It's just about remembering the fallen from the First World War, but also remembering the current conflicts which I've been part of. I've served in the army for 22 years, and I was injured myself in Afghanistan in 2012. And my way of remembering it is a charity that I work with called Soldiers League. We get injured soldiers physically and mentally to rugby games as part of their rehabilitation.
Excellent.
So currently I'm on my way to Elland Road for the final England versus New Zealand test match, and we're taking about 7 injured soldiers with us to watch the match, have a meal, meet the players, and just help them in the rehabilitation, just get out, show them that they are supported, and just get interested in get them out and about again.
When you think back, Steve, to your time in Afghanistan, does it bring a lot of sadness to you, or do you think, no, this just had to be done?
I was massively proud about what he did in Afghanistan. I know a lot of people wasn't, but it was a job that had to be done, and if we didn't do it, I think there'd have been a lot of problems around the world. And it's one of these things. It was a conflict where sometimes the forces felt like their hands were tied, where they couldn't do good for doing bad. So all we did was just did our job, did it to the best of our abilities, and hopefully made a difference, which I believe we did.
I tell you, one way you certainly made a difference, Steve, is that I think because of our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, the concept of war, the concept of people being killed and wounded, actually has been brought home to a younger generation to whom, let alone World War I, World War II seems perhaps like ancient history. So I do think, actually, Steve, I do think a younger generation think more about this than perhaps the one that went before it.
Exactly. I mean, my daughter's school had a remembrance service on Friday, which I attended, and I went in my blazer, my medals. After the service, the kids were allowed to go see the parents, and all the kids made a beeline for me with my daughter to ask about my medals, what was going on, and just ask questions about not just obviously Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, all that sort of stuff, about the older generation and the there but not there campaign that's been going on about remembering
Yes.
One of their main goals is about educating the young, and I think that's a massive thing.
Absolutely.
Educating the young, and they were so interested that the head teacher cancelled the classes and just let us speak till lunchtime. Let the kids ask questions and stuff.
Steve, do you know,
I think it's a massive thing.
there's a change of mood out there. 25 years ago, there was talk, should we end Remembrance Day? You know, does it mean anything anymore? I think there's a younger generation who are genuinely interested. Steve, thank you, and keep up the good work. Marty says to me on Twitter, today we pay respect to all those who have paid the ultimate price for a freedom which too many today take for granted. Well, of course, when you've got it, you do take it for granted, I guess. It means a lot to me. My dad served in the army since he left school. He fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and yeah, no. You know, I think, as I say, this is now because, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we've been involved in those wars, but I do think a younger generation are more connected to the concept of war and loss than they were a quarter of a century ago. That's my feeling. Marion is calling from Finchley. Good morning, Marion.
Good morning, Nigel. My father fought with the Royal Inniskillens in the First World War, and an uncle was in the Royal Flying Corps, so I'm remembering them, but I'm also remembering my father-in-law, who was in Czechoslovakia and conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army to fight, and in the first sort of battle that he was expected to fasten his bayonet and go and plunge it into somebody ahead of him, he thought to himself, this isn't for me, and he took out his pocketbook, shot himself in the left hand, was supposed to go to prison, but the authorities thought that would be what he'd want to do, so they made him go back to the Russian front. He escaped, managed to get home, and then got from his mother's house to Vienna. He walked to Vienna and spent the rest of the war in Vienna in the attic of his employer, a hatter, making hats for the rest of the war. So I'm remembering him, but of course all our wonderful, wonderful men and women of this country and the Commonwealth as well, who fought so bravely. And I fought the festival last night. I was in tears, and I stood when the poppies were falling, for the 2 minutes at the Royal Albert Hall in front of the royal family, and remembering, so not just those who died, but of course those who were injured, who are still suffering, and the bereaved. Nigel, wasn't that moving?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And Marion, and particularly today thinking about the First World War, but the hundreds of thousands who died of wounds in the years that came afterwards. And, I'm old enough to remember people who had huge breathing problems because they'd been gassed and all the rest of it. Marion, thank you for your call. Now, Angela in Lewisham says, what an amazing 10 minutes listening to the description of the signing of the armistice by the relative of Admiral Weems. Angela, it was extraordinary. It is all there right now on lbc.co.uk. It's a story I genuinely think that people simply don't know. I'm going to refrain from making a political comment about it because it is Remembrance Sunday, but you can watch that on lbc.co.uk and you can make your own minds up. You're listening to LBC on this Remembrance Sunday. It's now 10:30, and so what does this Remembrance Sunday mean to you? And to Constantine on Facebook, she says, Remembrance Sunday makes me think of my grandfather. He would never speak of the war. And I think, Constantine, as the years have gone by, we don't just think about the fall, and we tend to think about people we know that were involved in it. And if we're of a certain age, we knew people in the First World War. The younger generation will have met and seen Second World War veterans, or certainly people from the Balkans or Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever it may be. And like you, Constantine, I'm going to think a bit today. Well, my own grandfather, my father's father, fought in the trenches in World War I, was wounded, came back on a hospital ship, and was very fortunate not to be sent back again. And I did this morning look at his medals and photographs, and I think a lot of us are doing that, and perhaps we're doing it more this year than we've done certainly in recent times. Now, ever since 1921, the organisation that was put together to look after ex-servicemen and women, people very often in the 1920s having a terrible time. Lloyd George promised people it would be a land fit for heroes. And what do they come back to? Well, mass unemployment, poverty, illness. For a lot of people, it was pretty awful. So ever since 1921, the Royal British Legion have been there. And those that were listening last year will remember we had the son of Rosemary Bennett ring the programme, and she'd been there selling poppies in the first official poppy day in 1921. And would you believe last year's Remembrance Sunday. She was out selling poppies aged 102. As a result of that phone call and the publicity it raised, she got the MBE. So I think LBC can feel very pleased for the role they played in that. Unfortunately, she died earlier this year, aged 103. But the Royal British Legion, they organise what's going on down at the Cenotaph today and much of what is happening around the country. And so I think it's important on this centenary of those guns falling silent on the Western Front to think more about them. I'm joined by Alex Owen, Head of Armed Forces Engagement at the Royal British Legion. Alex, welcome to the programme. It's 100 years since those guns fell silent. There have been a lot of wars since. Do you think that a younger generation today sees this with the significance that it used to?
Hi, Nigel. Yeah, I think it does. We are now 100 years on from the armistice year, and this year the Royal British Legion have been really trying to put youth and diverse communities at the heart of remembrance. And actually, if you look around communities across the nation, you'll see the thank you movement, which is where we're trying to get the nation to thank the generation that served, sacrificed and changed our world. And a lot of that has focused on the youth element. So there are thank you schools up and down the country who have been thanking people, communities, pioneers, women and children from that First World War generation in ways that are really special to them. Yeah, and I'm right in saying that 1921 was the first year that the Royal British Legion started doing this. It was indeed, yeah. So it's a wonderful thing. Obviously, in 2021, that'll be our centenary as an organisation, so that'll be a special year for us as well. But this year really is about thanking that First World War generation, probably for the last time before we move on and start thinking about those from more recent conflicts, especially for me, close to my heart, the men and women that served in Afghanistan. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the fact that we've had people serving in Afghanistan, Iraq, perhaps has made it a bit more relevant to the younger generation, the fact we've had people killed and maimed in those wars. But let's go back to the very beginning, the poppy. Now, I've noticed that the poppy takes many forms. You've got a traditional one, I've got a metal one. There are lots of different kinds of poppies out there, I've noticed in the last couple of years. But I know there was a Canadian medic called John McCrae who wrote a famous poem about poppies. Where did the whole thing start? Well, indeed, yeah. In Flanders Fields was his famous poem, and it was from the tragedy of war that sprouted the symbol of hope, and that is exactly what the poppy is. It's a symbol of hope. It's not a symbol of war. It's not a symbol of glorification of war. It is a symbol of hope, so that we never have to go through that tragedy again. I think that's really important that we get that across this year. And I'm actually wearing a Cardi poppy. So it's not the traditional poppy. This is a poppy made from Cardi cotton, which is synonymous with Mahatma Gandhi, and this is to recognise the 1.5 million Indian Army soldiers that came and fought for us. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've been to the Menin Gate, and I've seen their names up there, and I've been to Neuve Chapelle, which was a big engagement where the Indians served, and you're quite right, that shouldn't be forgotten. And of course, 40% of all the contribution in two world wars came from what was the Empire, what is now the Commonwealth, a fact that shouldn't be forgotten, and I know you're doing your best to make sure that it isn't. Are we, and this is really important to me and I'm sure to you, are we through our schools making sure that our children understand what this day means? I think we are definitely trying to do that, Nigel. I mean, this year alone we've signed up loads and loads of thank you schools. There have been youth groups across the country who have been engaged in the thank you competition, and they've been creating works of art, they've been creating poetry, they've been sculpting, they've been doing all sorts of amazing things to symbolise their thanks for that generation that served and sacrificed. And do you think every school is talking about this? I think every school is talking about this in some way, shape or form, some more than others obviously. There are some great examples. The Choir Schools Association, and there are loads of those across the country at every cathedral, they've all been involved in a composition competition to help thank that generation. Okay. Now, when I was young, the middle of the poppy used to say the Haig Fund, because this is how the whole thing started. Field Marshal Haig, who I know from the 1960s onwards became this figure that was much maligned, but actually by ex-servicemen back in the 1920s, they had a great respect for him. But the original idea of setting the poppies was to raise money to help predominantly disabled ex-servicemen.
important, because we see people out collecting money on the streets and at train stations. Tell us exactly, when we buy our poppy and we put our money in the box, tell us where that money's going now.
It's a great question, Nigel, and thank you for bringing that up. So this year we're actually trying to raise £50 million, which will be a record number, and that money will go to the armed forces community, whether that be serving soldiers, sailors and airmen and their families, or whether that's veterans and their families. And the ways that the money is used is everything from care and independent living for those in their old age, like Second World War veterans, all the way back to there's something called the Centre for Blast Injury Studies nearby at Imperial College London, which is doing amazing work in trying to prevent the horrific injuries that come from IED, improvised explosive device blasts, or indeed help those that have been affected by blasts live long and fruitful lives. So some amazing work going on in the community across the nation.
Because in many ways there are people that have come back from Afghanistan and Iraq who would have died in previous wars, but our medical care is so much better that we're able to keep people alive. But there are quite a few thousand young men and a few women out there too living with pretty bad injuries.
There are, and there are scars seen and unseen. So, of course, we've got to bring attention to the mental health element of this as well. And we are working, we work very closely with our partners, Combat Stress, who were also founded after the First World War. And actually, those were pioneers. They're actually a thank you partner within the movement that we're doing this year. And they're celebrating the fact that they came out of the tragedy and they were pioneering mental health for servicemen 100 years ago, and as they are still today.
Would it be fair to say that maybe we've underestimated the mental health side of people who've been through conflicts?
I think that we're learning as we go, and I think every year we get better and better at doing it, but it's a difficult thing to do because they are unseen scars, and without a community around them to help manage it, it becomes quite difficult, which is why actually the Royal British Legion provides an amazing community for veterans. It's got 200,000 members and growing, so it's a wonderful thing for people to join that have served.
Yeah, and last year we had a phone call from the son of Rosemary Bennett, who had been on Kew Bridge in 1921 for the Royal British Legion, and I'd asked people to ring in and tell me what did this day mean to them? What did the whole Remembrance event mean to them? And her son rang to say, it'll always mean my mum, because she was on that bridge in 1921 selling poppies in the first ever proper official appeal. And I said, well, that's a magnificent thing to say. He said, yeah, and she's still out there this year. And I had a bit of trouble with the arithmetic. She was, of course, 102. She got an MBE. She's no longer with us. But even the Second World War veterans that are out this year selling poppies, let's be honest, the numbers are declining pretty quickly. What does the Legion need to carry on this work? Do you need more volunteers? Do you need more help? I mean, because this doesn't end just because it's a centenary. You've got a lot of work to do. So please tell LBC listeners, what can they do in the future to help you with your work?
I think one of the most important things that people across the nation can do is to advocate the fact that remembrance is for everyone. It's accessible to everyone. And we've tried to show that this year by including the Commonwealth, quite rightly, by including women and children, women that stayed behind on the home front and worked in factories, fought for the right to vote, were nurses on the front. And so it really is an inclusive symbol. And I think what we're really trying to push and what we're really trying to tell the nation is that it's for everyone, regardless of whether you've got a connection to the armed forces or not. It's a symbol of hope. So please do support us.
Now, the women in Warpoint, there's a station just before City Airport called Silvertown. And I often think to myself when I go through there on the Docklands Light Railway, I wonder how many people know that in 1917, an explosion at a munitions factory and 400 young girls were killed in that. So I think the women at Warpoint is one that perhaps, again, we haven't given full prominence to. And finally, please, Alex, tell us, 100 years on from the First World War, the biggest sacrifice that we as a nation have made in any war. What is the message to a younger generation about this incredible sacrifice?
It's quite simply to spend your 2-minute silence today thinking about that generation that served, sacrificed and changed our world, and thanking them.
That was Alex Owen, Head of Armed Forces Engagement at the Royal British Legion. You're listening to LBC, this Remembrance Sunday, and it's now 10:45. All over the United Kingdom, people are getting ready for services, both large and small. We're going to go first to Cardiff, to the Welsh National War Memorial, to speak to LBC reporter Dan Wilson. Dan, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. Yes, well, as you say, here in Cardiff, the sun has actually come out this morning, thankfully. It's been a pretty wet and miserable night, but thankfully the weather has improved, and it shows in the number of people, I think, that have turned out here this morning, here at the Welsh National War Memorial in Cardiff. Not just, as you say, politicians and members of the royal family, but hundreds of members of the public as well. Already, we've seen this morning members of the Salvation Army, the band, come through in a real poignant moment. But as well, we've seen the National Book of Remembrance just brought right across the road as I'm looking at it now from the Temple of Peace, which is just right here in the city centre of Cardiff, actually brought through as well. And as I'm looking at it now at the Glamorgan building of Cardiff University, not full of students today, full of dignitaries, including Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant of South Glamorgan. She is here representing members of the royal family, of course, with the Queen leading tributes down at the Cenotaph in central London this morning. In a moment, they'll be heading out and down those steps and across the road, just a short walk over to this memorial, where they will lay wreaths, not just, as I say, members of the royal family, but First Minister Carwyn-Jones, of course, here as well, and the head of the army in Wales, Alan Richmond. Of course, from then on, at 2 minutes to 11, the last post will ring out, as it will across the UK, before a gun salute just in Cathays Park here, which will mark that poignant 2 minutes silence.
Thank you.
Now, after the Exactly. Well, after the service, there'll be a march down towards City Hall, which is just a short distance from here. From then on, though, the First Minister will lead a service of Thanksgiving at Llandaff Cathedral, which is only a few miles outside of Cardiff here. And then tonight, a real poignant moment. We'll see beacons of light lit up right the way across Wales, which will be a poignant tribute, I think, to the 40,000 Welsh soldiers who lost their lives in that First World War.
Thank you. That was Dan Wilson from Cardiff. Let's go to Edinburgh and speak to Derek Ferguson. Derek, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. Commemorations have just started here at the Edinburgh's Royal Mile, the Stone of Remembrance, just outside St Giles Cathedral, where First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is going to be attending a service. There are a load of dignitaries and ex-servicemen right now from Poppy Scotland, from Legion Scotland, who are now out carrying wreaths. More than 100 are going to be laid at the Stone of Remembrance here for the fallen who've lost their lives in conflict. I don't know if you can hear behind me just now, but the brass band is piping up at the moment. They were marching down the cobbled streets of the Royal Mile earlier. Hundreds of members of the public have turned out as well. It's a grey and overcast and, to be honest, a cold day, but that's not stopped people from turning out to show their respect.
Thank you very much, Derek. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as you can tell, big events happening all over. Let's take a caller before we get back to others. Brian is calling from Harrow. Brian, what does today mean to you?
Morning, Nigel. You haven't got long enough for me to tell you, but I'll tell you in a brief description, basically. My dad went away when I was 3.5.
Yes.
And I remember waving goodbye to him at Paddington Station, and the next time I seen my dad, I was 8.5, nearly 9.
Wow.
My dad was in a boat going to Singapore just before Singapore fell, and lucky they had engine failure about 150 miles away from Singapore, and the boat got diverted to Darwin in Australia for 6 months.
Otherwise he'd have been a prisoner of war, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. And what happened then, they went to India, and my dad was in the Chindits, and my dad fought the Japanese behind enemy lines with General Wingate.
Yes, Ord Wingate.
And also mixed with American forces. But my mum also helped to build Wellington bombers. But not seeing my dad from 3.5 to 8.5, and when they say now they're away for 6 months, I know it's different. The end of the world is nigh. I don't know how my mum survived all that time, and I don't know how my dad and my uncles came home in 1945, and my dad never came home till October 46.
But he came home, Brian, and a lot of people of your generation where their fathers didn't come home.
But he had nightmares, Nigel, and think they never looked after people like not my dad particularly, but everybody really. After what they'd been through, and you imagine the way can you imagine being away for 5.5 years? And my mum used to get a letter every 3 months, 6 months. And every time she opened the letter or whatever, she didn't know if he was there.
Brian, as you say, a big day for you to remember that, and thank you for calling. I'm going to go to Staffordshire, to the National Memorial Arboretum, and talk to Josh Giltrap, an LBC reporter who's there. Josh, hello.
Well, you can hear behind me the Royal Marines First playing out as around 10,000 people are seated and stood at the Armed Forces Memorial here now, as prayers have been read and hymns have been sang ahead of the silence at the National Arboretum here in Staffordshire. In preparation, roads around the nearby village of Orrewas have been closed off and guests have been bussed in. Shortly, there'll be a laying of wreaths from representatives from all areas of the British military, including Royal British Legions, the Navy and the Air Force. Last night here, 500 people took part in a candlelight vigil to mark the centenary, and at 11 o'clock we'll be observing a 2-minute silence to reflect on this hugely significant day.
Josh, thank you. And finally, let's go to the Cenotaph and speak to Rachel Venables. Good morning, Rachel.
Good morning. Well, for the past 40 minutes or so, service detachments from the Royal Navy, the Marines, the Army, the Air Force and more, as well as veterans from all ages and experience have been marching down towards Whitehall, towards the Cenotaph. The atmosphere is just electric. You might be able to hear the near constant clapping, the cheers from the crowd as certain regiments pass them, and of course the beat as well of the marching bands. But this will all fall utterly silent at 11 o'clock when Big Ben chimes on the hour for one of the first times since last August. We'll have the 2-minute silence, of course, observed nationally. We'll have buglers paying out the last post, and then the royal family and politicians will lay their wreaths. For the second year in a row, Prince Charles will be stepping in for his mother, the Queen. And for the very first time, a German politician, the German President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, will also lay a wreath as a symbol of how significant this centenary, this 100-year recognition of the armistice, of course, is here today in Whitehall.
This is the first time, Rachel, isn't it, that there's been German representation at the Cenotaph?
It is the first time that German will have laid a wreath, will take such a significant role, coming right after, of course, Prince Charles, yes.
Yeah, no. And Rachel, as I was coming into the LBC studio this morning, I saw a lot of people on the streets of London. I'm guessing the crowds are pretty big down there.
Absolutely packed. There are thousands and thousands of people. As you look towards Whitehall, there are metal barriers right the way lining the roads, and the crowds are 4-5 rows deep, as you are, of people. So I can see children on their dad's shoulders, all trying to get a glimpse. As you get to the Cenotaph, really rammed in and packed, but everyone here just wanted to play a part in this service, which of course starts very soon.
Rachel, thank you. Sophie on Facebook says, the significance of today for me is my late granddad, who was involved in the war. And with other veterans, he fought for our freedom. So I think 100 years is a very, very long time. We think of people that we knew. If we're of an older generation, if we're younger, we think of people who've been involved and people who've been lost in later conflicts. But it means a lot to nearly all of this nation. This is LBC, and now we cross to Simon Conway.
It's exactly 100 years since the armistice that ended the First World War, the moments when the guns fell silent along the Western Front. It's also Remembrance Sunday, where we commemorate those who've given their lives for their country in the 2 world wars and all later conflicts. In a moment, we'll join the Queen, the Prime Minister and veterans at the Cenotaph on Whitehall in observing 2 minutes silence. But first, Nicole Zheng won first prize in the age 9 to 11 category of the Royal British Legion's World War I Centenary Poetry Competition. Here she is reading her entry, called Still Remembered, Never Forgotten.
Still remembered, never forgotten. They marched for freedom, they marched for joy. They did it for their country, the one some left behind. Some of them lie in a beautiful place. Some of them lie in a warm, cosy grave. Wherever they are and whatever they did, we have to thank them for the world as it is. They marched for us, leaving families behind. They fought for us, knowing they could die. They fought for valour, for bravery and joy. They fought for their girls and they fought for their boys. The lush red poppies that grow in the field are a symbol of sacrifice, of those who didn't yield. We are thankful to them, and thankful we'll stay, and because of them, we're here today. It is approaching 11 o'clock on Remembrance Sunday. This is a chance for us all to come together, to remember, to reflect, to honour all of those who have sacrificed themselves to secure and protect our freedom with a 2-minute silence. Thank you.
2 minutes silence to mark the armistice ending the First World War and to remember all those who've given their lives for their country. This is LBC. Here are the...
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've had the national 2 minutes of silence. That is the 100th anniversary of the armistice. And I wonder, what were you all thinking about during that 2 minute period? And one person who will have been thinking about that period and will have actually remembered the armistice is 112-year-old Grace Jones. She is the oldest woman alive, oldest person alive in this country today. And she told the story last week about her brother who'd gone to live in Australia and who had joined up with the Australian Army. And in 1915, he was killed at Gallipoli. And she said, a postman came to the door, and that was what everybody dreaded. The postman coming to the door, knocking on the door, delivering the telegram, and she said, a postman came to the door, and I knew my brother was dead. So that's what Grace Jones would have been thinking about in that 2 minute silence. And I don't suppose there are very many people with memories of actually those events of 1918, but there are still some, despite that spread of time. I'm going to ask Mick in Romford what he thought about in that 2 minutes. Hello, Mick.
Hello, Nigel. All the usual things, I guess. But when you was talking about Lloyd George earlier on,
yes,
I just thought about the politicians. They just never learn, do they? You know, it goes on and on and I remember when I looked at the poppies in the Tower of London the other year, and
they were amazing, weren't they?
Yeah, but I think to myself, why don't politicians take that on? You know, I just can't understand these people.
Well, I suppose all through history, Mick, people will have had politicians they like and politicians they don't like. I think, of all of it, the promise of a land fit for heroes is perhaps the one that would have upset people most. Mick, what involvement do your family have in the wars?
Well, my dad was in the First World War. He was in the Royal Navy.
Yep.
My oldest brother was in 44 Royal Marine Commando out in Burma.
Uh-huh.
And my other brother was in the Navy, joined in 1944. And so we're steeped in it, to be perfectly honest.
Yes, absolutely.
And I said to your producer, just a little known fact is that the fact that for all the troops that crossed between Britain and France, not one was killed by enemy action.
I know. It's absolutely incredible, that, isn't it?
No, that was the Dover Patrol. It's not incredible. It was the Dover Patrol.
Yeah. 6 million British soldiers went over to France, and of course some came back on leave and some came back wounded.
Yeah, right.
But millions of troop movements and not a single one lost crossing. And they went mostly from Folkestone, Mick, didn't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, when my dad was in the Dover Patrol, they used to take the monitors up to the Belgian coast, and they used to shell the Germans from the sea. I don't suppose too many people know that either.
Yeah, if you go across and turn right at Calais and go about 5 miles up onto the chalk cliffs,
mm-hmm.
And it's Cap Blanc-Nez, the white nose, and there is a huge memorial up there, Mick, to the Dover Patrol.
Is there?
Yeah, and if ever you're going through by car, short detour from Calais,
mm-hmm.
take you 10 or 15 minutes to get up there, and there's a tribute to the Dover Patrol, which your dad served in. Mick, thank you. I'm going to go to Anthony in Ealing. Anthony, what did those 2 minutes make you think of?
Oh, well, good morning, Nigel. It's nice to speak to you again, even though I've never been on your programme. We have met briefly.
We've met, have we? Right, okay.
You won't remember.
Well, good morning, Anthony.
Anyway,
good morning.
I'm thinking of my father, Private Charles, of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, who had his 21st birthday in the Battle of the Somme.
Oh, really?
Which, as you probably know, I passed through it on the main road from Calais to Paris. I've done that journey many times.
Yes.
I think about him, and if I've got a few... that was 1916, I think.
Yes.
And I was born in 1937, so if he'd have got knocked out in that battle, I wouldn't be speaking to you now.
Well, this is true. This is true. And Anthony, it means something to your generation. What do we say to people aged 15 or 20 about that, do you think?
Well, I think we ought to look at the political situation. In hindsight, I think we ought not to have got involved so quickly. Maybe we should have waited a year until we were stronger. I wouldn't apply the Second World War, which, of course, I was a child in the Second World War and remember it very well. But I think it's interesting to compare the political situation that politicians in intelligence, all parties and talent, was very low prior to the First World War. Also, it was the same period prior to the Second World War. And I think we've got the same problem now, and it's not a war, it's Brexit, which I support. Nevertheless, I think there's very low-grade politicians at the moment on all three occasions.
Well, I tell you what, Anthony. I tell you, if we'd had this phone in 1940, people would have said very low-grade politicians have led us to this. Anthony, thank you. I remember the sad loss of relatives fighting for a lie, says Chris, and it's important that we do understand a lot of people, particularly after 1918, were deeply resentful of the war. There was a very big peace movement in this country. The Oxford Union, in 1933, there was a motion that they would not fight for king and country, and it passed. There was a Spinsters League, because, of course, there just weren't enough men around. The Spinsters League had tens of thousands of members, and again, they were campaigning against war. So there was, in the wake of the First World War, amongst large sections of the population, great bitterness. Amongst others, there was huge pride that actually the British Army had achieved something truly stunning in the last few months of the war on the Western Front. I'm going to go to Jane, who's calling from Welwyn in Hertfordshire. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning.
So what sort of went through your mind in those 2 minutes, Jane?
Actually, my nan and her mother. My nan had three brothers. Mm-hmm. Two died in the war, Second World War. One on the road to Changi. The other one whose body was never recovered. The youngest brother was drafted at 17. He went out into the desert, and he was not in charge, but he was bringing back tanks that had bombs dropped inside them. They had these awful bombs that used to whiz around inside the tanks, and he used to have to bring those back. He didn't come home until 1946, and he basically, they called it shell shock then. He ended up living with my nan. He never married, never had a family. Ruined his life. So basically the war killed him, even though he didn't physically die for another sort of 60 years. So I'm just thinking of the horror. And because one of my nan's brother's body was never found, every time my great-grandmother used to keep looking down the street, hoping that he'd walk down the street, and she did that until the day she died. You
really grew up with this then, Jane?
Yes, I grew up because, my great-uncle, I used to go and visit him. He had a room in my nan's house. He did work, but that was it. He went to work and came back. He would never buy... He loved the technology that was coming out at the time, like record players and things, but he would never buy Japanese. He refused, and they were, of course, the leading sort of manufacturer of all the technology at the time. And he refused point blank. He would never buy anything Japanese.
Yeah, I can certainly remember people saying that when I was younger. But a big act of reconciliation today, Jane, with the German president being there present at the cenotaph.
I don't know. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, as with all these things, there's always a big division of opinion. Jane, thank you very much for your call. Now, some reaction to the poem that was read out, and written and read out by Nicole Zeng, and this won the Royal British Legion Prize for poem this year, written by a schoolgirl. Tony says, what a wonderful poem from such a young girl. And it was a very, very good poem. It was beautifully simple. Nigel, I'm a serving airman. I'm not an emotional man, but that little girl's poem brought a tear to my eye and opened a flood of tears during a 2-minute silence. Wow. I thought of all the heartbreak of all those conflicts and that they inevitably bring. Andrew from RAF Coningsby. Well, that's quite powerful, isn't it? Going to go to Chippenham and speak to Tom. Tom, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Nigel. Nice to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. So what did you think of, Tom?
Well, I was thinking about my father, who, in the First World War, he started off at about 15 or 16 in the same 1915-16. He was gassed twice and wounded and still came back to survive. And as people have earlier said, without them, we wouldn't be here today, literally.
No, absolutely.
Even.
And did he suffer much as a result of the gas, Tom, through the rest of his life?
I often notice in the obituaries, in the Telegraph and others, how people do last. My father was 86, and you look at the obituaries in the papers and see how long these people did last, even though they had terrible, terrible situations in the First World War. But the other thing I just wanted to say, somebody a few minutes ago talked about politicians.
Yes.
And I just remember, again, some years ago, Mrs. Thatcher, was it that increased the war pension for the widows who were living on absolute pittance?
Yes.
And the man is right. The politicians never learn.
Well, maybe that was one case where something good did get done. Tom, thank you for that. Thank you for your memories. You're listening to LBC on this Remembrance Sunday, and it's now 11:15. When the armistice came, most people were hugely relieved that the war was over, certainly those serving at the front. And in London, there were the most incredible and outrageous scenes of celebration and public emotion, and I'll leave it at that as it's Sunday morning, but extraordinary scenes that took place in central London, kind of people celebrating the victory of life over death. But it wasn't a happy day for everybody. Think of Wilfred Owen's mother, living in Shrewsbury. You know, the bells are ringing, the war is over, and on that very day, the knock at the door from the postman, the telegram that Wilfred Owen had been killed on the 4th of November. So not happy for everybody. And I saw an extraordinary letter that was written by a girl to her mum and dad. And dear mummy and daddy, what an extraordinary day this is in the history of the world. And she goes on to talk about bells ringing and celebration and everybody being given the afternoon off so they can remember how wonderful this day is. And she's at a boarding school up in Hertfordshire. And then she says, Frida Weston, who is in my room, heard this morning that her brother-in-law had died of wounds. I felt so very sorry for her. Her sister is quite young with 2 small children. It's very hard for her when everybody else is inclined to be happy. So it wasn't a happy day for everybody. And you know, the Americans took 3,000 casualties on this day, and the British Army took 900 casualties before 11 o'clock in the morning. So it wasn't a happy day for everybody. And it's why I think Remembrance Day is actually a pretty sombre day. Margaret is calling from Caterham. Good morning, Margaret.
Good morning, Nigel. Actually, I have remembered 2 of my uncles who were in Japanese camps
Yes.
and were never able to speak of what happened to them. But mostly I'm remembering the animals.
Ah, that's very interesting, Margaret. That's very interesting. No, go on, please.
No, I'm going to say I do wear the purple poppy, which is for the animals who have died in war.
Yes.
It's becoming more and more popular every year. But they don't have a voice to speak up for themselves. They didn't volunteer. They were dragged along to whichever war they were needed. And they were victims. They weren't heroes, they were victims. They died terrible deaths, as did our Army and Air Force and whoever, you know, took them with them. But very rarely do you hear the animals mentioned during commemorations like this.
No, it's a fair point, Margaret, and of course, well, mind you, Warhorse, of course, was a massive success, wasn't it? So,
brilliant, absolutely
brilliant,
I
do
yes.
think that Warhorse brought, you know, to a lot of people an understanding of just the extent to which not just horses, but of course donkeys, mules were used as well. Margaret, it's very interesting. I've read some diary accounts from infantry soldiers on the Western Front who talking about the sheer suffering of the animals, and that upset them as much as the suffering of human beings. So I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of horses were sent to the Western Front and died, but it's a vast number, isn't it?
It is a vast number. And they starved and they froze to death.
Yeah, and I mean...
as did the men. I know the men did as well. And it's just appalling. And pigeons who carried messages. And a lot more people would have died if it wasn't for the help of the animals.
Yeah, no, and you see those photographs of the limbers being pulled by horses, going up through sort of mud up to their knees and all the rest of it. Margaret, I think the point about the animals is a very fair one, and there is now a memorial to the animals that have died in war up on Park Lane, which you can see if you're in central London. I'm going to go to Pat, who's in Devizes. Pat, good morning.
Good morning. I think about my father.
Yes.
My father was an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
He would have volunteered. In fact, he was in the Home Guard. But because he was an engineer, he was seconded to Stothard and Pitts in Bath, where he made parts to keep the warships going. Nobody ever thinks about these people.
Yes, so he was in a reserved occupation, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. And there were also... No, Pat, you're right. And there was another group of people that don't get talked about, the Bevan boys. And they were
My brother was one.
And they were conscripted and put down the coal mines when, actually, in most cases, they'd much rather have joined the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy. No, Pat, that's a very, very fair point, and we do forget about this bit. And did your father regret the fact that he hadn't gone?
I think he did. He was active with the Home Guard.
Yeah.
And was always deeply offended by the Dad's Army.
Yes.
Deeply offended by that. It makes me smile when I think about that one.
Yeah, well, a bit of truth in Dad's Army, there wasn't there? I mean, in 1940, we really couldn't have defended ourselves at all, Pat, could we?
I agree. I think that it was the characterisation of the characters. We really weren't that bad,
Well, no, but we weren't that well armed, and I think comedy always works when there's an element of truth in it, Pat.
I agree,
yes. Pat, thank you for your call. On Twitter, very insightful article earlier about how Lloyd George politicised the timing of Remembrance. LBC.co.uk, see the interview that I've done with Jamie Weems, the Earl of Weems, about his relative, who was the British signatory in that railway carriage in Compiègne. It explains how 11/11/11 came to be. And yes, the British government wanted it to be later in the day. And I've given you the facts that we had 900 casualties on that day. How many more would there have been had it not been till 2:30 in the afternoon? I think that it speaks for itself. I'm going to Cobham to speak to Terry. Terry, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. What I thought about was, and there's a very big point at the end, I'm going to make it as quick as I can. Of course, I thought about my relatives.
Yes.
There's a programme on BBC. You may have seen it, and I'm sure your listeners did. And it was about, but the point is at the end, my point. And it was about the Bell brothers, Martin Bell's 5 sons. And they came from Arworth, Haworth, where the Bronte sisters come from in Yorkshire.
Yep.
And in the First World War, the 5 boys were sent off, and a woman was on the television. She was a great-great-granddaughter. She had this wonderful, picture, but it's my point at the end, please. And they saw this wonderful picture, and a letter from Dad, I hope to see my boys come home safely. Needless to say, 4 of them died. There was one, and the mother, which was a great-great-grandmother, wrote off to, I think it was the army, but I think one went to the Queen, and it was passed that he could come home. And the chap commentated and said, it's like Private Ryan, I agree. Yes. So my immediate reaction is, having wrote a couple of books, I thought, what a story. I have never heard anything like this in my life in British history. Never, ever once. So I Googled it. I Wikipedia'd it. I made my inquiries. There is not a mention of it anywhere. And I just couldn't work it out. It must be a mega story. And my wife said to me, why don't you Google about brothers and see what happens out with the First World War? And do you know why it wasn't commonly known? Because it's so common. 4s, 5s, 3s, 2s, brothers, all over Great Britain. It was amazing. That's what came home to me. It wasn't, it was a common thing. Yeah. And I thought it was like something wonderful. What a story.
Yeah, and he did.
And it wasn't.
And it worked, Terry, didn't it? Because that 5th brother did get sent back home.
He came home,
yeah. He did. And there was...
Yeah, William his name was, yeah.
And there was a mother in Worcestershire who lost all 5 sons in the war. That was...
Yeah, but there you proved the point. I just thought it was unique, and it obviously wasn't. But
I think in terms of people getting sent home for the front on compassionate grounds, this didn't happen too often. Terry, it's a great point. I'm going to move on. Lots of people want to speak. And because one of the problems here in the First World War was what was called the PALS battalions, where a whole factory would join up, a whole street would join up. They'd all be in the same battalion. They were part of Kitchener's army. And the thinking was, morale would be great, because brothers served with brothers. Fathers and brothers served together. People who've been classmates served together, and this was thought to be good for morale. But if you were an unlucky battalion in a very bad place, like the Accrington Pals, for argument's sake, the effect on a community would be devastating. And in World War II, we did everything we could to break up brothers and communities and spread people about a little bit. We really, really did. I'm off to Miami in Florida to speak to John, who's a new caller. John, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you, sir?
I am well. Now, we're not going to discuss the recount that's going on in Florida from the midterms, but we'll do that, because I've said it's a politics-free zone this morning as much as possible.
I heard you earlier say that, and I will respect that. Absolutely, sir.
Yes, so, John, come on, tell me, the 2-minute silence, what were you thinking?
It should be done, and we should be recognizing this across the globe and honor it for what these young men and women had to go do for our freedoms.
Yes.
It's giving me goosebumps now thinking about what an 18-year-old or 17-year-old that lied about their age just to go in. We don't have that today. But what we have is the poor young men that are in this battles today that we're fighting for no reason. It's amazing what it does. My Bapu fought in World War II while my mother, my yaya, and my aunt lived in a cave on the island of Leros in Greece. And while the Germans were bombing that island, they were starving to death. But my Bapu was here in America and signed up with the Army and went and fought because it was the right thing to do. After the war, they came to Ellis Island as immigrants, and today we honor this day.
Yeah, the one thing that does surprise me, John, is America's very good with its history. It's a young country, but people know all about the Civil War and World War II. World War I, they don't know much about, and I think it's regrettable.
Correct.
It's regrettable.
It is.
For whatever reason it may be that President Trump wasn't able yesterday to go to Belleau Wood, because it might have brought it might have brought that aspect of it to a wider, bigger American audience. Generally, John, I find in America that the sacrifice of World War II is quite well known.
Yes, it is. You are correct. It's the dumbing down of our schools that they don't push and recognize the fight that went on in World War I and the lives that were lost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. John, thank you ever so much for your call. I'm going to go to Ali in Hounslow. Good morning, Ali.
Yeah, hi there, Nigel. How's it going?
It's going well. So what did you think of, Ali?
Well, I'd just like to put an emphasis and reminder on the East African front, in which many Commonwealth soldiers fought in both World War I and in World War II, East African front of World War I against the German colonial fighters in present-day Tanzania, in which soldiers from across British-speaking colonies from Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, British Protectorate of Somaliland all fought together and defeated the Germans. And the Second World War II, the East African front, in which Italians invaded the British colony of British Somaliland, which was the first British protectorate that got invaded. And it was amazing, in which my mother's grandfather, as well as soldiers from across Africa, as well as the Indian Punjab officers, united Malay officers as well and liberated that territory. And this is a reminder of where I'm from, British, the Somaliland, in which in Somaliland, Hargeisa, they are remembering the fallen soldiers.
Yes, absolutely.
And the campaign that we want as observer status under the Commonwealth for Somaliland, because my family, we fought.
Ali, I support this cause. I'm not going to go deep into it today, but I support this cause. I did say earlier, I'll say it again, 40% of the UK's total effort in both world wars came from the colonies, came from what's now known as the Commonwealth, and they were all volunteers. And we remember people also who were serving on this day 100 years ago in Italy, Mesopotamia, Palestine, Salonika, and elsewhere. You're listening to LBC on this Remembrance Sunday. It's now 11:30, and there are 10,000 veterans there in Whitehall as we speak, and very shortly the Royal British Legion march past the cenotaph will begin. I'm going to go into the crowd now and speak to retired Lieutenant Colonel Peter Barron, who served with the Royal Corps of Signals. He's marching today with the Hague Housing Trust, and they're hosting a pilgrimage of 100 veterans and serving personnel who are going to walk 100 miles from Ypres to the cenotaph. Oh, they've done it already, I think. And Peter's walking in memory of his grandfather, Sergeant Webb, who fought in the First World War and won a Distinguished Conduct Medal. Peter's got the medals and a citation with him, and he's also remembering his great uncle, Chief Stoker Albert Brown, who was on HMS Pembroke and died. Peter Barron, are you there?
I am indeed. Good morning.
Good morning. So explain, have these marchers come from Ypres to the cenotaph?
They've come from all three services, well, Army, Navy, Air Force and Royal Marines.
Yes.
Veterans and serving soldiers. We started out from Ypres on Wednesday morning, and we've marched. Well, actually, it was a walk at times, and in fact, sometimes it was a bit of a hobble.
Right.
We walked 25 miles a day, each day, arriving here at the Cenotaph last night.
Fantastic. And you've encountered gales, heavy rain. It must have been quite difficult.
Yes, the first day was interesting. Belgium threw its worst weather at us for most of the morning.
Yes.
We walked to the coast near Dunkirk, and then we zipped under the Channel. And the second day we walked from Dover to Canterbury. That was a good day using the Pilgrim's Way, so it was cross-country type stuff.
Yeah, I know it very well.
Then we walked from Canterbury up to Gravesend, and yesterday we walked from Gravesend to the Cenotaph, arriving just in time for the deluge that hit London last night.
Well done. Now, the Hague Housing Trust, and Peter, this word Hague, I mean, in the middle of the poppy, it used to be called the Hague Fund, and of course, Field Marshal Hague was, our commander during World War I. Tell us what the Hague Housing Trust does.
Well, the Hague Housing Trust was formed just about 100 years ago, and they provide housing for our veterans in need, and they have done since the end of the First World War. So their job never finishes. At the moment, we've walked this 100 miles. It's been called the Long Walk Home, and you will see some guys and girls in red jackets around London today with the Long Walk Home logo on those jackets. We've honoured the people in the First World War by completing this march, and we've honoured their memory. But it was twofold. What we were also trying to do is raise awareness and raise funds for the Long Walk Home and for Hague Housing, because the need doesn't go away. All we can do is honour the veterans of the First World War, but the current veterans and those guys and girls who've been injured in current conflicts are going to need our help for a long time to come. That's why we're doing it.
Excellent. Well, I must say, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Barrow, well done for your endeavours, and very good luck with your continuing work for the Hague Housing Trust. And in a way, that's the story, isn't it? Hague, this housing trust set up nearly 100 years ago, but it's not just history, because they're still there, they're out there raising money, because there are plenty of ex-servicemen having a tough time today. And, we've talked a little bit this morning about mental health and those other issues. Still a lot of ex-servicemen, recent ex-servicemen, having a very, very tough time. And, that is important that we deal with it. Darren says, my gran told me of the Silvertown explosion. I mentioned this a little bit earlier on. When she was a child, they lived in Rectory Square, Mile End Road, and watched the Zeppelin raid happen. A big bang, as she said, and bits of metal landed down where they were stood. She also saw a Zeppelin come down in flames as well. Darren, again, probably a younger generation not really understanding the sort of continual air raids that were happening on London in 1917 and 18, some before, and not just Zeppelins, of course, but Gotha bombers also being used in 1918, particularly with attacks on London, prompting the royal family to actually change their name and become the House of Windsor rather than Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. So, this involves civilians too, very much. Dave is calling from Stevenage in Hearts. Dave, good morning to you.
Hello, Nigel.
Yes, hello there, how are you?
I'm not too bad.
Good.
I've just been to the remember Stevenage Memorial service.
Yes.
And during the 2-minute silence, my eyes are drawn to a couple with a bulldog.
Yeah.
And this bulldog was sitting there with poppies on its collar, and it looked grumpy and it was dribbling. And I was thinking, that's what Hitler never knew about. He didn't know about the bulldog.
Well, you may well be right, Dave. I don't know. And tell me, do you go regularly to the Stevenage War Memorial?
I do, and I tell you what, there were thousands there, absolute thousands.
Interesting.
And instead of being something that's been forgotten, I think it's getting more and more popular. Right?
Interesting, Dave. Thanks for that. Interesting, Dave. It's funny, isn't it? I've been fascinated by this subject, and particularly the World War I, since the mid-1980s. And I've visited various sites in France and Gallipoli, scores and scores of times. And when I first used to do it, people thought it was really weird. And now, people say, oh gosh, we've been, and hundreds of thousands of British people every year go and visit some of these sites, and I think always take something from that experience. And I wonder whether, with 100 years now, this big moment, I wonder whether interest might begin to diminish. I don't know. I really don't know. Tell you what I do know, and that is that we as a country, and our Commonwealth, our empire as it was, have done one hell of a lot of good for free speech, liberty and democracy in this world. And we can be very proud, I think, of those that went before and served, and those that are still serving today. And I really do believe that very, very strongly. Michael is calling from Brighton. Good morning, Michael.
Hello, Nigel. Pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, welcome. So what did you think of in the 2 minutes, Michael?
I thought it was pretty sobering, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just like to mention my father.
Please do.
He fought with 23 Long-Range Chindit Brigade.
Yep.
Second Duke of Wellington's 76 column. And they spent 3 months behind Japanese lines near the Kohima battle.
Yes, yep. This was, they had villagers, of course, that would help them, and then other villages that would betray them. And,
yes.
And the price of getting caught by the Japanese was not a very pleasant one, was it?
No, he always said, save a grenade for yourself.
Yes. I think that's true, isn't it? I mean, that was pretty much,
yes.
Because they were behind the lines, they were liable, I think, to be treated as spies rather than being treated as fighting soldiers, and the end would have come pretty quickly. And Michael, tell me, did your father readjust to normal life, sort of,
Well, I did. After that, he fought in Burma proper with 1st West Yorkshires and something called Special Force Reconnaissance Section.
Yeah.
So after all of that, he did return to England. He was released from the army in 1947. A bayonet wound got him out of the war.
Yeah.
And I think he sort of did suffer some sort of breakdown because of the severity of the fighting.
Yeah, and did you see that, or was that kind of kept from you?
Well, it was speaking to my uncle, who used to go and visit him in hospital, and he said there was nothing there. He'd just sort of sit there and talk to him. And then eventually, I suppose he came out of it.
Yeah. No, Michael, it's difficult for us to imagine, having lived civilian lives, what it must have been like for a lot of people coming home from those experiences. It really must. Thank you for sharing that story with me. I'm up to Hartlepool to speak to Alan. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning. Yeah, on this day of remembrance, I would like to mention the men of the Merchant Navy, thousands of them who were lost crossing the Atlantic, bringing us supplies, and the runs to Murmansk. They never seem to get a mention for some reason.
Well,
we should not forget them.
You're absolutely right, Alan. And if you go down to Tower Hill, opposite the Tower of London, next to Trinity House, there is the Merchant Marine Memorial from both World War I and World War II, and it's a deeply sobering place to go. You mentioned Murmansk and Archangel, the convoys in World War II, but of course, in World War I, there was a relentless U-boat campaign that actually had Britain down to 6 weeks' food supply. That is how close unrestricted submarine warfare came to the Germans starving us out. So, no, Alan, you're absolutely right to mention those people, and I thank you for it. You're listening to LBC This Remembrance Sunday. It's 11:45. It's 100 years since the armistice, and it's a very special day for Dilys Fox, who now lives at an old people's home in Sussex, because it's her 100th birthday. And would you believe it? Her middle name is Armistice. She's Dilys Armistice Fox. Happy birthday, Dilys. 100 years old today. I also have got so many comments coming in, and lots of comments about the poem that you heard earlier, and we'll come back to that. Also comments and tweets that we're seeing about the interview that we had earlier with Jamie Weems, lbc.co.uk. You can go to for that. I'm going to go back to the Cenotaph and speak to Rachel Venables, who's been there for the National Service. Rachel, hello.
Hello, Nigel. Well, long after the 2-minute silence had ended, after we'd heard the blast of the cannon, the last post, of course, the streets here, packed out with tens of thousands of people, stayed utterly still. It was just incredible to watch and to hear, as all you could hear was just the rustle of the wind, the trees. There's so many tens of thousands of people stayed utterly silent, just watching, just thinking, reflecting, as of course politicians, members of the royal family as well, stepped up to the cenotaph to lay their wreath. So many people clearly just so moved by what they've been experiencing. You've been hearing, I think, as well, just down the line now, the clapping and also, of course, the continued marching band as well. That's because we're now experiencing a march past. So we've got thousands of veterans of all ages, some clearly just out of the armed forces, some very clearly needing a little bit of help from children or grandchildren being wheeled, many of them in wheelchairs, all making their way past this procession. Incredible, again, to watch. And I've been speaking to people, some with a military background, some very much not, about how much this service moved them today. They both said it was incredible. The first person you're going to hear from is former Sergeant Captain in the Navy, Donald Mackay. He was taking part in the march, but because of his age, he started to feel a little unwell and had to be pulled aside.
I was feeling faint. We've been standing a long time, and I'm not good at standing. And it was just, didn't march that much. It was quite emotional, really.
And to see so many people of different ages and service history, did you get speaking to many of them, or...?
Didn't really. I belong to the RNA, and I'm in the Irish division, and I didn't actually come across any more Irish here. I actually have the Irish poppy, to see it.
Oh, of course, with the shamrock as well.
Yeah.
And, sir, can I ask, at the 2 minutes silence, who did you think of and what did you think of when you were up there on the march?
I don't know, really. Just colleagues, just wondering where they are. You know, you ships that pass the night is the expression, isn't it? You never say goodbye in the Navy. You say cheerio, see you again. That's the way it is. That's what I was thinking about.
And I guess when you were in the Navy all those years ago, did you ever think that you'd be here for something like this to mark 100 years since
Never
the first?
Never did.
Well, my name's Paul Ripley. I'm a chef by trade, and I've come all the way out from Cornwall yesterday.
And talk to me about why. Why did you want to be here for this? That's a long journey.
It is a long journey, yeah. My girlfriend's family are here today. There's 3 generations of the same family marching past the cenotaph today, which is quite a special occasion for those guys. So, yeah, I'm with them.
And during the 2 minute silence, during all of this, I guess what was going through your mind? What were you thinking about during that time?
Yes, it was incredible. Yeah, I think it was very emotional, isn't it? I think very, very moving. I don't think I've been moved as much since my own dad's funeral. I think that today was just so incredibly moving. Yeah.
What was it about? Well, I guess why? Because I mean, you compare it to your dad's funeral. There aren't many more things I think that could move a person more than something like that.
I don't really know. I can't put my finger on it. You don't even know any of these guys that have died, and that's the thing. You're shedding a tear for people that you don't know, but it's just for what they've done for the country, isn't it? You know, you're just incredibly indebted to them. Yeah.
Two very apt, I think, examples of the sort of people you're getting here today, the difference in ages and experience. There's some with a lifetime of service, others with no experience at all, but all wanting to be here today to mark 100 years since the end of World War I.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And it is amazing, isn't it? As the guy from Cornwall said, he doesn't even know anybody that's been killed in the war, and yet somehow it feels incredibly emotional. And there will be at 12:30, the Big Ben's going to chime again. Now, the earlier ringing of Big Ben was muffled. They actually put a sort of leather thing on it to make it a lower, deeper sound. But at 12:30, it'll be a joyous peal of bells. And there's been a sort of agreement with the British and German governments. This is going to happen over many parts of the UK and many parts of the continent too. Rob, who's from Enfield, says to me, I look back today at the likes of my grandfather. He joined at the age of 16 to fight the Hun. Well, that was the language very much of a day. He became a corporal, and while behind enemy lines at the Somme, his sergeant and other higher-ranking officers were killed. He was now in charge and had to lead the men back to safety lines. The action earned him the position of King Sergeant, so he could not be brought to trial or court-martial without the King being present. Well, there you are. Lots and lots of stories. Some relatively happy, a lot very sombre and sad. Elizabeth is calling from Bishop Stortford, a new caller. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. So what do you think about on a day like today, Elizabeth?
I think it's something we should keep remembering. I also think we need to do a lot of work for the people who are the soldiers who are suffering now.
Yes.
And I think when you look back over the years, war isn't getting us anywhere, is it? We're still warring. There's been wars since the beginning of time, and it's still happening. It's incredible that we're not learning anything.
Do you know, at the dawn of the 20th century, Elizabeth, there was a lot of speculation, and people genuinely believed in late Victorian England that we'd moved to a different period, that all the horrors that had seen before wouldn't happen. We were now more advanced, we were now more educated, and of course the 20th century turned into the worst there'd ever been. I think the truth is we've learned absolutely nothing, Elizabeth, yes.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
But amazing that we still have men and women who are prepared to put their lives on the line for this country.
Yeah, we do. I know there are one or two discussions about recruitment at the moment and levels and morale, but yeah, no, absolutely we do. Elizabeth, you know, there was a massive pacifist movement in this country in between the wars. We've had some big campaigns from the 60s, 70s, 80s for unilateral nuclear disarmament, and there are still a good number of pacifists in this country today. But isn't the truth of it, Elizabeth, however awful war is, that we have to be prepared sometimes to fight to defend our way of life?
I agree. I do agree with that, but I think we should be thinking of the soldiers who have put themselves forward
yes.
and are now back and suffering. We need to do more for them. We can't have these people put their lives on the line for this country, whether you agree with war or not.
Mm-hmm.
And when they come back, they're not helped.
No.
They are left.
I think we all agree with that, Elizabeth. More should have been done and more needs to be done. Thank you. My granddad fought in World War II in North Africa. He was in an armoured car, as they were called back then. Hugely proud, and I should be thinking of him and all the sacrifices that were made, says Johnny in Norfolk. Now, many of you earlier on were very moved by Nicola Zeng's poem. She won first prize in the 9 to 11-year-old category of the Royal British Legion's World War I Centenary Poetry Competition, bringing Thank You to life. And it was so good, I think we'll hear it again.
Still remembered, never forgotten. They marched for freedom, they marched for joy. They did it for their country, the one some left behind. Some of them lie in a beautiful place. Some of them lie in a warm, cosy grave. Wherever they are and whatever they did, we have to thank them for the world as it is. They marched for us, leaving families behind. They fought for us, knowing they could die. They fought for valour, for bravery and joy. They fought for their girls and they fought for their boys. The lush red poppies that grow in the field are a symbol of sacrifice, of those who didn't yield. We are thankful to them, and thankful we'll stay, and because of them, we're here today.
Well, that was Nicole Zeng, an absolutely beautiful poem. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show on its 100th anniversary of the armistice. I'm back tomorrow night at 6. At 3 this afternoon, it's Ian Payne. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.